Welcome to the FMCG Guys, the podcast that dives into the innovation, strategy, and trends shaping consumer goods and retail in Europe and beyond.
Welcome to the FMCG Guys podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Torres. If this is the first time you tune into the FMCG Guys, we speak with top talent, leaders, and luminaries in the consumer goods and retail industries. We're now over 150 episodes in. So if you want to check out the plethora of leaders that we've hosted here, go into our website or on the podcast player you listen to, and you can entertain yourself and be educated with some of the industry's top voices. Do remember, we're part of a family of podcasts headed by the CPG guys in the US. We recommend you tune into their show to learn about all the consumer goods omni industry, if you like, in the US. And you'll find there the link to their website on our digital liner notes. And also, if you haven't yet, remember to follow us on LinkedIn, where you'll be joining a community of 14,000 plus members and counting. And you can also now find us on Instagram. So if you haven't yet, follow us there, because it's a great way to stay up to date with whenever we launch an episode every Wednesday and Saturday, for example. And in this adventure, been lucky enough to be accompanied by some great people. But one of the best is my co-host, Efrain Rosario. Hey, Efrain, how are you?
Hey, Daniel. Nice to be with you as always.
Likewise. We'll be meeting soon a couple of times, first in London and then in Shop Talk. Maybe by the time this airs, this will have happened already. But look forward to meeting you twice in a short amount of time. Hope you don't get too overwhelmed by my intensity.
No. I'm sure that if this publishes after that we've gotten together, I'm sure we'll have had a good time.
Exactly. If it doesn't publish, well, then it doesn't publish for some reason. But it should be published. So today, really excited about our guest who's coming to speak about his career, in which he's had the experience of managing situations of very high stakes, especially in M&A. And it's Rob Chatwin, who's currently the CEO of the Eden project. Hey, Rob, how are you?
Very good. Very well. Thank you very much for having me on the program.
No, it's a pleasure. We had it. It was a long time coming, so I'm glad that we finally landed you. Rob, one thing that really fascinates me about you is your origin, because one could think by the looks and the name that you're English. But tell us a bit about where you grew up.
Very good. Well, I mean, the name suggests that I'm English, but my dad was English. He went to Brazil in the 1950s. And so I was born and brought up in Brazil. And he decided to make his entire career in Brazil. So I went to a Brazilian school all the way until I was 15. And then I did come to the UK to finish the schooling. And that's where I started my career.
Yeah, which is great, Rob, that background, because that means that we can speak at least in English. We can also speak in Portuguese. I guess that you could also wing Spanish if you don't speak it already. So
yeah, so I know it's half my life. I mean, I was brought up bilingual, Portuguese and English. We spoke English at home, but Portuguese was always the language with friends and school and so on. But and I learned Spanish along the way. So I really enjoy speaking Spanish, and I don't do enough of that at the moment.
Rob, you and I have we're the inverse, right? So I grew up bilingual as well, but I learned Portuguese after Spanish. So
really? Yeah. I
yes.
mean, knowing one or the other is helpful, isn't it? I mean, people say they're very similar languages, but when you're actually learning it and writing it, they are totally different languages, but they do help each other in understanding.
They do, and we end up speaking, at least what my Portuguese teacher would have told me, something called Portunal, which is a mix of the two, right?
That's exactly right, yeah.
Perfectly beautiful Portuguese, but I spoke enough of it so that I could get by.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of language, is to communicate and be able to understand each other. No, so that's my background. And during my entire career, I was in and out of Brazil. Brazil is very much part of, sort of who I am. And there's a whole cultural aspect to it, which sort of it stays with you for life.
Well, as somebody who lived in Brazil for a year, I can relate to that. There's something about it. It stays in your blood and in your soul. So
It stayed in me after a month and a half. So there you go.
Yeah.
And so then I came to the UK to do the last bit of schooling. And that was a bit of a shock to go from, a city of 20 million people, big city, São Paulo, to a tiny little village in sort of in the middle of England. But it was amazing. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the change in culture. Obviously, the change in weather wasn't as good, but it prepared me for the next stage, which was just a natural move to go to university in the UK.
Mm.
So, and once you sort of get into that rhythm of, a country, it just meant I also started my career in the UK. I started working in London, which was a great place to start working and starting a career.
So, can you tell us a little bit more in terms of like where that career where it started and where it kind of took you to, in terms of today?
I think, some people are very lucky. They like, they have a passion for science or they have a passion for engineering. I had, I didn't have a vision that I wanted to become a doctor or something like that. So what happens is I decided to study economics and didn't know too much about economics. And actually, it was only towards the end of university that I started really enjoying that. But similarly, so what you do with an economics degree, I chose then to become a chartered accountant. So I joined one of the big four, KPMG, and they had a wonderful starting program in London where, it was almost like an extension from university where 180 people are selected to join the London office. And it's a combination of working and studying. I thought they were joking after we did our first exam and they said 1 down, 99 to go.
Oh, God.
And I thought, well, it sounded like a joke, but actually it was close enough to reality. I thought, is it? And it really was. I mean, obviously, every year you had between 6 and 10 national exams, public exams, but all the exams to practice and train for it. But it was a great grounding in finance. And you also learned how to deal with different industries, different clients. And during that stage, you get exposed to all sorts of industries and different roles. So it was for me a great starting position.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I imagine as somebody who started at one of the big five as well, it also just teaches you general problem solving skills as well in terms of being able to tackle a challenge and breaking it up into parts and basically tackling those things systematically. That's at least that was my experience.
Efrain, you're absolutely right. I mean, problem solving is so important in our lives, and how little of that do you get at school, right? And so it was very helpful having that during my first 3 years, something that you take with you for the rest of your career.
Yeah, but Rob, it is true that maybe you didn't know what you wanted to do, but it is true that relatively early on in your career, you started doing something that's kind of really determined your career and made you, I think, marked your profile, which is M&A, right? So how did you get into M&A and what did you find interesting about it?
So just to, it's quite interesting. We were talking about the Spanish earlier. So after my first year exams, I came back into the office and there was a little Post-it on my phone on the desk, which we still had in those days. And I called the extension. And the guy at the end of the line, he spoke to me in Spanish, asking me if I could go to Cuba for the next 5 weeks. And I thought, is this for real? Well, as you know, probably KPMG in the US weren't allowed to do services in Cuba at the time. This is early 90s. So they then went to the London office. And in the London office, there were not so many Spanish speakers. So I was invited to be one of the juniors of this sort of transaction. And it was my introduction into mergers and acquisitions. I was doing the accountant's role. We were doing the due diligence. it was the Cuban Telecom selling 50% of its stake, and the eventual buyer was a Mexican company. And so I had 5 or 6 weeks in Cuba, which was great for my Spanish, great for the experience. But I got introduced to these investment bankers and the whole deal team, and it opened my world about mergers and acquisitions. And from then on, I was always quite interested and excited how to steer my career towards that.
Rob, it sounds like such a terrible thing, like in your 20s, to be pulled out of London and be taken to Cuba for 5 or 6 weeks.
I mean, it's really lucky, isn't it? I mean, I think in somebody's career, you can do everything. You go to the right schools, you can get the right exams, but you always need a good dose of luck. And at the end of the day, you've got to be able to enjoy it.
So, Rob, and remind me after this recording, I'll have to tell you my story about how I ended up in Brazil under very similar circumstances, by the way.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
But I'm curious to understand, what is it about M&A that you find particularly interesting? Like, what drew you in when you got that call? Or actually, I guess after you got that call and you were working on the project, what is it that drew you in and kept you in that space?
Well, first of all, in those days, they didn't have a department called transaction services or corporate finance. It was special work. So I was on special work, and that immediately makes you feel, privileged. And so it takes a little while to understand the whole situation, but it's exciting. There's a deal, but there's also an element of trying to understand the value, create a picture. I had been trained 3 years in audit, where people look to the past, try to see if the numbers reflect the actual business. But this was looking to the future. What is the potential? And I felt that I was so much more excited about the future and looking at that rather than the past. And as my career progressed and I moved away from the role of the accountant in a deal to the role of the investment banker in the deal, that adrenaline of the deal, the ability to advise clients, that was for me really exciting. And as I moved in that experience, then what I realized is that what I wanted to become was the CEO. Not only from a deal perspective, but I got to meet the CEOs through the deals, and I got to understand much more about the leadership element. And that's why possibly 8 or 9 years into my career, I went back and I did an MBA. That was my sort of route to change careers. And I applied to a school in Switzerland called IMD. I was lucky enough to be accepted. It's a very small cohort. And that year for me was totally transformational.
Mm-hmm. And fast forward, like obviously then you left the consulting and world, and you went into corporate, working in Philips in mergers and acquisitions and strategy, and finally you ended up in Natura, which is a Brazilian company whose like sales model is social selling, so similar, so the audience understands, to Avon. Tell us about the company and what made you join it back then, leaving an international company like Philips.
Sure. I mean, Philips for me was an amazing school. It was straight out of business school. I did a stint in Amsterdam, a stint in the UK, where I ran a company called Avon, baby bottles, infant feeding. And then Philips took me to Brazil, being part of sort of the Latin American executive team. And during that first year, I came across Natura. One of the guys I had gone to business school with, Brazilian, was visiting with him, and I met his older brother, who was the CFO of Natura. And up until that point, even though Natura is an incredibly famous company and extremely successful in North America, I had only just heard about it without really understanding it. And meeting the CFO, who turns out to be a really special person, I got to know a little bit more about Natura. He got to know a little bit about my background. Little did I know that Natura was thinking about internationalizing at that point in time, thinking about mergers and acquisitions as a vehicle to do that. So they introduced me, or Roberto introduced me to the founders of Natura. I met each one, extremely special people. And but after the seventh conversation I had at different points, I thought, well, that's probably enough because, I have a full-time job. This is really interesting, but I hadn't realized they were actually sizing me up for a job. So then I said, look, guys, it's been really great, but this is, probably enough. And then they said, no, we want to invite you. And I said, invite me for what? And then they made a job offer for me. It was a wonderful invitation. They were looking for somebody who was Brazilian, but had an international background, international experience, somebody who had run a business before, but understood mergers and acquisitions, partnerships and alliances. And so it seemed like a tailor-made job for me. And I joined them. I mean, it's an incredibly special company that listed on the stock exchange, so all the best governance, as well as having 3 controlling shareholders. So you had almost like a family feel to the company, even though the agreement between the shareholders that none of their family would work in the company, which for me was an important aspect before I took the job on. But yeah, so in a fantastic way, at that point, I made a real choice, leaving the sort of the comfort of a very established, large, capitalization company and moved to a Brazilian company. And before accepting, I did reach out to a number of my trusted mentors, and one of them said, Rob, at this stage of your career, don't think about a career path anymore. Think about a career adventure. And for me, that was incredibly insightful and just, gave me the confidence to really go for it. But not
just so people know, Natura basically, it's similar to Avon, like beauty products, social selling. So it's also like a quote unquote traditional business model in some way.
Very. So Natura was founded in the late 60s, and it was very much inspired in the model by Avon. And what's really special about that is that it has a real social importance. It's of social importance. It takes people of humble backgrounds, not necessarily with formal education, not in the formal job market, and allows them, and it's typically 90% women, to be able to so complement the family income. But it more than that, it allows them to become the leaders that they're meant to be. And it's really special because women have such an important role in society, and at a family level and a community level, they are the transformation agents. So joining Natura, you feel that you're creating the environment for this to happen, and it's such an important social sort of positive impact in the community. So many people don't necessarily understand that model, and certainly in the beauty markets around the world, that model isn't as present as it is in Latin America. And for those that don't know Natura is world class on all items of sustainability, both social, like we mentioned, but also certainly environmental. Really on the world stage for that. So when I was going through this process, I almost felt that Natura was too good to be true when I was doing my due diligence. I had sort of my Anglo-skepticism was forcing me to really dig deep there. And actually it was a wonderful experience over 11 years with them, where a lot of the experience I had accumulated in my career until that point really was, I was able to draw on that together with the wider team in Natura to take a company that hadn't done M&A to doing 3 significant transactions and incorporating them into sort of the group. Obviously, the situation with Natura, they have reversed after I left. They reversed the strategy, and it's not the same at the moment.
So I was going to ask, in that role that they created for you when they gave you that invitation, I'm assuming that obviously you leaned into your M&A background to drive some of those acquisitions. Are you able to speak to some of that? And I guess just like back, you were in that moment. What was driving your decision making in terms of the acquisitions that you made?
So there were two. It was a double strategy. One was how to get the Natura brand sort of known by the consumer world and so on. So we had a brand internationalization strategy, which included sort of some exposure in retail and so on in Paris. And to be fair, that was initiated before I joined, and sort of had been present there for a number of years. But there was a desire to expand that and to become more exposed in terms of the same thing with the US and in New York. So that was the organic plan. The inorganic plan, either through partnerships and alliances, was really one which we wanted to find companies that shared the values. So, a very sort of sustainable, environmentally conscious. Natura is also a company that is somewhat different in the beauty industry. For example, it doesn't believe in beauty stereotypes. And that's incredibly important because the majority of the beauty industry relies on beauty stereotypes in its marketing, for example. So Natura was really against that. At the time as well, there was this real sort of, element in the beauty industry about testing products on animals. So animal testing. Natura for many, many years beforehand had, avoided that. And so things like that really define the values. So it was using those kind of concepts that we wanted to find like-minded companies in the beauty space that could form part of this group. Almost like being able to achieve Natura's mission, but through other brands. And that was the crux of how I created the acquisition strategy of looking for these companies. And 2011, for example, we were invited to look at a really interesting company called Julique in Australia. And it was during that due diligence process, when we were visiting all the different department stores, that I came across Aesop. And, Goldman Sachs was selling Julique, and I kept on looking at Aesop. I had this criteria that a business had to be, over 150 million dollars worth of turnover, because we are in Brazil. We want to buy a company that has management, right? And so Julique was ideally sized, and Aesop was just too small. But that's when I got to know Aesop, which was our first acquisition. A year later, Goldman Sachs was looking for a new buyer, a new owner for Aesop. And that's when we got into that process.
Which Aesop, I think, was recently sold for a lot of money, right?
Yeah, so Aesop, when we bought it, I think this is all public information, so I feel comfortable sharing, was valued at approximately 120 million Australian dollars. It had a 50, 60 million turnover, about 50, 60 stores. It's not a million per store, but in the whole mix. And last year, you're quite right, Danielle, it was sold to L'Oreal for 2.5 billion. So in that 10-year period, it's increased value in 20 times. It was an incredible journey. And I was delighted for part of that journey that, I was part of that Aesop team as a chairman of that business.
Yeah, and one of the acquisitions, I think this one is pretty amazing, but one of the acquisitions which is also fascinating is the fact that Avon, in the meantime, which was kind of the business model that had inspired Natura, was not going very well. I think they split the North American business from the rest of the world. And guess who acquires the rest of the world's Avon business? Natura, right? Which was a very clearly synergetic move. But how were you involved in that?
Yeah, so ESOP, like you said, there was no synergy at all, right? Apart from the sharing in values. And the job there was to create the environment for ESOP to keep true to its values and its brand. And absolutely, that's what they did in a fantastic team. Then between ESOP and Avon, we had the Body Shop. So all these acquisitions give a bit of muscle and training for a group to be able to, to do more difficult and more and larger transactions. So skipping now to Avon, this was a very large transaction for Natura. It was an incredible, sort of synergistic opportunity in Latin America. And that was the real driving force of the transaction. Today, you will see that Natura is fully integrated with Avon in Latin America.
Uh-huh.
And, where that business model is still extremely strong and has a lot of potential. Natura was quite advanced in its digital platform and using sort of the digital modernization of direct selling, right? Social selling. And so the idea was to include some of that thinking in the Avon business model. And so like you said, the US was already no longer part of that deal, even though they had there is still a license and a brand in the US, but that wasn't part of the transaction, the acquisition by Natura. So we split Avon into two: one, the Latin American business, which was to be consolidated with Natura, and another one, the Avon International, which would, stand on its own 2 feet, and we would search some synergies with the Body Shop in terms of the wonderful, sort of manufacturing facilities that Avon have that were underutilized. Could they be utilized for producing some product lines at the Body Shop, for example?
And because that's the thing, right? Like, there's some acquisitions which are very synergetic, and some which are not. Like, what was the thinking behind that?
So when we first did ESOP, we knew there would be very limited synergy. But it's always very important to identify the value drivers. So what would create the value at ESOP? Well, ESOP was relatively small and was getting to a stage where it would have to invest in systems and processes and so on to allow it to expand in its growth. Natura had gone through that stage, had done that, had come out the other end. So being able to support ESOP in that journey was one of the very important elements of how to allow ESOP to grow. So, for example, being able to afford some external consulting help to figure out a growth strategy, something that ESOP by itself wouldn't do, but together with Natura, we were able to do that. And putting 2 or 3 elements like that, which then, of course, the ESOP team being extremely proactive and really amazing team, they just soaked up all that they could take, and then they would then sort of use that and really expand their business. Then other businesses have other drivers, like the one in Avon. The driver for us to buy that were the synergies that could be generated in Latin America. You had 2 businesses which were over, $2 billion each, so $5 billion business in Latin America now combined. And you imagine all the distribution going to people's homes. A lot of the consultants sold both brands, sold Natura as a more premium brand, and so Avon as a slightly more accessible brand, depending on their client. So, in fact, the merger had been done at the consultant level before Natura and Avon got together as corporates. So you can then rationalize the distribution. Not only do you have an economic impact, you also have a huge reduction in carbon. And so it's a really, there's some fundamentals that just worked extremely well. And that was with the Latin American business. Less synergies in the international business, but at the same time gives Natura, a platform from which to launch its business at some point outside of Latin America.
So, Rob, I would be remiss if I didn't ask. You mentioned digital transformation of direct selling and how you were able to take that and apply it in some of these acquisitions that you made. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that actually meant in terms of like what were some of the digital tools or technologies that you were applying to this direct selling business model?
Well, imagine that the traditional model is with a magazine, a brochure, right? And people then would have that and speak with their clients about what products. So you need to now comes in a mobile device. So you have to transform that entire brochure into the digital aspect. And Natura, this is where you have a company that really thinks it's through. For example, we hired an incredible guy as the head of information technology, right? But somebody who had the desire to go into business. Today, the person that runs the Brazilian business is that guy. So he has that background, right? And so the transformation comes from within. A number of people who do the consulting the traditional way, they prefer to do that because they won't change. So we have to accept that. But the younger ones, or the ones who are more open to change, we need to create the right tools through the mobile devices. And it's a different type. So we had to do lots of different testings. You test, you try it fast, you fail fast, you keep costs to a minimum, you pivot, and that's what Natura did extremely well. So they, agile teams, incubators, some of those tools that you read about are high technology companies. This is where Natura was investing. I remember doing a partnership with MIT in the US where, the access to data was a dream for those MIT scientists. And so you see a nice partnership there. So those are some examples of the digital transformation.
And Rob, I'm sure that apart from the acquisitions that you've done, which, I mean, what brands? No, Avon, Aesop, The Body Shop, like nobody's heard of them, have they? And I'm sure that you also look at other companies doing M&As and you, with your prior experience, what's the bottom line here? Like, why do some acquisitions fail? And what can companies do to avoid that?
Okay, so there is a statistic which talks about 70% of acquisitions failing. So the majority of acquisitions fail. And, it's really a shame to see that. But typically it's because strategies are not well thought through. And then even if they are well thought through, they're not adhered to. There's often leadership changes. So when you're in, you should be in, and you should execute and should obviously be open to, sort of outside stimuli and changes and course corrections. But a lot of the value that one would expect at the business case moment doesn't get delivered, and that's what causes this failure. So what we did, and I think is just known as a successful tool, is to create a transformation structure where you have different work streams working with the different value drivers. And that's then a matrix across the organization. It's extra work. It's, a period of 2 or 3 years, but it diminishes that failure rate incredibly. And so that concept of the chief transformation officer, it's still relatively new and not many organizations use it. But that is one way to avoid, sort of the value destruction. In fact, to, confirm the value creation. Obviously, some deals, how can I put it? Not all deals are born out of the right motivation. And the right motivation has to be things like, is it value creation? Is it synergy? Is it, an entry position? Is it, something more to do with the higher purpose, creating, like we talked about Aesop, there was no synergies, but creating the environment. And so I think it has those motivations have to be really well understood.
Mm.
So having that a good understanding of the purpose of the transaction, and then setting up a structure to be able to capture and allow for that very purpose to happen.
So I'm curious to get your perspective, Rob, as somebody who has been in this M&A world for quite some time, as to the panorama or the current landscape in FMCG, and how have you seen that evolve over time? And I guess where are we today in that world?
Well, it varies a lot. I mean, you see some giant and very impressive companies like Unilever taking a route to, again, focus in certain areas and therefore go through a series of divestitures. You see other companies like in the beauty space, like L'Oreal, continuing their acquisition trail. And they're an incredible company. That's why they're number one in the world. They cover all aspects, an incredibly well-oiled machine. So there is not one thing, right? I think it's to do with the strategy that the company has sort of written, decided on, the leadership being behind that strategy, and creating the right competencies. In the beauty world, for example, it's so easy now in so many parts of the world to rely on third-party manufacturing, sourcing, distribution. So therefore, in essence, relatively small businesses can start very fast. Lots of very creative entrepreneurs who have great ways of, thinking about brands and concepts. So it's just natural that we have more and more small and really cool brands, which will capture consumers' imagination. And therefore, the bigger companies will always look to buying some of these smaller companies through their creativity and so on. And then these smaller companies can use the platforms which are created by the bigger companies. So in beauty, I see that there is still, a lot of potential for transactions of that nature.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in beauty we've seen a lot of those smaller brands coming up, as compared into like beverages or foods. No.
Well, that's right. I mean, when you get sort of obviously another impressive Brazilian company was 3G, the private equity, with the whole story about the beer consolidation, and then sort of turning into eventually Ambev and so on. The transactions there are really synergistic, looking for distribution, sort of big scale. So different parts of FMCG will be totally different. Yeah.
And Rob, you mentioned L'Oreal, and for me, as a spectator or a consumer, I've also seen that they've not just acquired product companies, but they've also acquired companies that have interesting technologies as well. So do you see that like almost like you said, like the objectives or the reasons behind these acquisitions, like you said, in some cases could be driven by a really innovative type product, but is it also bigger than that in terms of, like you said, technology and other things that could play in?
Absolutely. I mean, capabilities, right?
Yeah.
It's, companies can use M&A not only to grow their business, but to grow their capability of doing business. And I learned that in my first transaction with Philips. Philips bought a company whose main client was Walmart, had incredible success with Walmart in terms of their fill rates. And they bought that company that did, I think it was peripherals, accessories, basically cables. So it wasn't through the technology they wanted. It was just the ability to deal with an incredible client like Walmart. This company knew how to do it very well. And so I think companies that have mastered the M&A tool can use it really not only to bolster its market share or its geographic expansion, but also from a capability perspective. Not easy to do because it's a different type of retention of the people. It's a different type of culture that you're buying into. So you have to be very aware of that. And typically, culture, going back to the transformation, is one of the things that if it's not front and center, that is the main reason why even transformation programs fail, right? It's the cultural aspect.
Yeah.
And it's a bit more fluffy. Therefore, it doesn't really get on the Excel, get discussed sometimes at the C-suite, and you have to have a very good and sophisticated board aware of this to be able to bring that to the boardroom conversation.
Yeah, there's one of the main beauty companies which was basically created through a mega merger. We won't mention the name. I think one of the reasons why they didn't fulfill like not even a fourth of the potential was because they didn't get the culture right. And instead of like setting a clear set of values, they just went with, oh yeah, we'll just have the best of all worlds. And that didn't work out, did it? And Rob, one quick one. When we think about like FMCGs and the strategy we referred to Unilever before, going more slim, like in the last few years, we've seen companies, a lot of them focusing more on like what they call the core. But what do you think is better, to be more focused on the core and be more specific, or to have like quite a lot of variety of categories? I don't know, like Nestle, for example, which in times of like ups and downs maybe makes your portfolio more resilient, because if you lose from one side, you win from the other side.
So that's a great question, Daniel. I mean, for me, the answer is take LVMH, for example, a house of brands, where they will be able to synergize behind the scenes with brands, but the brand has to feel that it owns its absolute strategy, right? So if you work for a brand, that is who you work for. You don't work for the group. And that comes to answer the question about focus and, going to your core. You need the people that are working in a business to feel that they are really working on that business, right? And then you have to allow them to do it. So you have some groups that are very centralized, and those groups that are centralized will be difficult for them to emulate what I've just described. And therefore, maybe those groups that are more centralized have to be more aware of what the core is and how all the parts of the business are linked together. The ones which are more decentralized will allow for several cores to be focused on by several different teams. So there's not one answer to your question. It's how you set yourself up. That's how I see. So if you're more centralized and you want that level of control, then you have to be close to your core.
So, Rob, now we move into the present, or we're today, and I'm curious to hear more about your new role, your current role at the Eden Project. If you could tell us some more about coming from Natura and moving into this new role.
So at Natura, I moved to the UK through the Body Shop acquisition, whereas Aesop I could do remotely as a chair. But the Body Shop, I had to be physically present in the UK. So we moved to the UK, and my wife is from the southwest of the UK. So I was commuting to London to do that job. Then we had the whole sort of COVID, where we spent more time at home rather than sort of 300 days traveling. I would be mostly at home. After Avon, I got an invitation through sort of a personal friend to learn a little bit more about the Eden Project. Turns out they were looking for a new leader. And as I learned the Eden Project sort of opportunity, I thought, my God, there are so many synergies here with what I did at Natura. A successful business organization in a part, in a restricted geographic part, wanting to expand to many geographic parts. A business that had a combination of sustainability and commerce. Eden Project it's more sustainability than it's commerce, because it's mission and it's an NGO. It's a registered charity. I also felt that I wanted to move away from being a chief transformation officer to being the CEO. And so those combinations attracted me to the Eden project. Now, Eden is again a wonderful organization. It's in its essence, its core, it makes its money through a visitor attraction. So people donate to the charity. They spend a day at Eden, but during that day, they will learn about the environment and how we human beings are part of nature, and what we can do in terms of actions to reverse the climate, sort of crisis that we're living in. In fact, it's not only the climate crisis, it's the biodiversity crisis, it's a social crisis that we find ourselves in. That Eden Project also has an education arm, 250 degree students in horticulture, in sort of sustainable hospitality. It's in the rock concert business. We have 8 to 10 concerts a year. We license the brand, and we're expanding. And so, for example, that was the cherry in the cake for me that convinced me. We wanted to raise, £100 million for the next Eden project in the north of England, £130 million for the next Eden project after that in Scotland. There's an Eden project being built in China, in the city of Qingdao. When I joined, we had an Eden project pavilion in the Expo in Dubai. So the number of these expansions was what was exciting to me, and I saw an organization that needed to be prepared for that expansion. And so that's where I felt my skill set was going to be, and where it could be, it would be a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, which, by the way, I'll leave a link to the digital liner notes. Here we go. For the Eden project, because if people haven't heard about it, it's an amazing space in Cornwall. So you should definitely at least Google the Eden project, and you'll be surprised. One last one, Robin, it's the question we ask all of our guests, which is, with all the experiences that you've had in your career, if you went back to the beginning, what would be that one piece of advice you would give yourself with everything that you've learned?
Look, I mean, there's so much advice out there in terms of, you read these amazing books, you meet amazing people. And all I think there is not enough in the world of business is celebration. We all achieve. All the people listening to the podcast are achievers. And we all achieve and go on to the next achievement and the next task, and we do it. And we put such little time to celebrate your own achievements or the achievements of people around you. And I think if you were able to do that, it would just mean that the entire journey would just be a little bit more fun and a bit more rewarding for you and for the people around you. So I wish somebody had told me that earlier on, and I had, taken it more seriously. So hopefully, Daniel, that is something for people to take on.
Well, we've had a lot of conversation. It's the first time that somebody gives us that piece of advice, which I think is very valuable. Efrain, maybe when we meet in London next week, we have to celebrate.
I think we should. I think you've inspired us, Rob. So we need to find time to celebrate our achievements. And I don't think we're alone in that regard. So that's a really, really powerful piece of advice.
Exactly. So, Efrain, shall we go through your takeaways before we wrap up? What are your key learnings from this?
Well, where to start? I mean, there's so much. I think first off, finding somebody who I think we share a lot in common, Rob, with regards to like how we started our career in Big Five and then have gone in different directions from that. But that was a really interesting way to start the conversation. But then going from there and talking and hearing about, one, how you got started in M&A. But to me, what was fascinating was listening to you kind of in essence refer to how this opportunity with Natura kind of just happened organically. I mean, it wasn't like you went and for a formal job interview. It was just through conversations that you were having with these founders, and it just one thing led to another, and eventually, this position was in essence almost like created for you. And from there, you've gone on to bigger, better things, and capped off by where you are right now at Eden Project. But I think that's a good reminder for us to think about, that sometimes things happen in those interruptions. It doesn't have to be obviously methodically thought out. So for me, that was really, really interesting and a good reminder as well.
Yeah, clearly the social world is not separate from the work world, even if sometimes we would like it to be like that, or we imagine it to be like that. Look at you and me, Efrain, how we met, right? For example.
No, absolutely.
So that's an example of that. So, and in the mergers and acquisition space, I mean, what to say, right? Aesop, the Body Shop, Avon, big names. And I think it was interesting to learn about like the difference between acquisitions that have synergies, which is the classic case of acquisitions, and then value drivers where through your corporate structure, if you like, or your resources, you can really accelerate the brand, even if it's not totally synergistical. And hopefully that lesson and really having a clear strategy will help our listeners avoid that 70% of acquisitions that fail, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what's fascinating is that obviously a lot of us, when we have these conversations, we always ask, well, what are the keys to success? But as that statistic that Rob shared with us, with 70% of acquisitions failing, it's just as important, if not more so, to understand the reasons why things may not work out and being aware of those things. And what was fascinating for me, and again, it was a great reminder, I think, hopefully for those in our audience as well, is that the role of culture in all this, right? Is that you can do all these other things amazingly well, but if the culture isn't there, it may still not work, right? It's almost like it becomes such an accelerator for success when it comes to acquisitions that you can't ignore it.
That, and also think of like acquisition with strategy and with your company structure and your setup. No, I think that the centralized, decentralized was very interesting. Rob, thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you. If we don't see you in somewhere else, maybe at the EDM project.
Well, I was going to say, I hope to be there. You've inspired me, Rob, to definitely check it out and to have a look to see if I can maybe swing a trip to the Eden Project next time in England.
We'd love to host both of you. Thank you so much for being on the program. Let me be on the program. Really enjoyed it and wish you success. Thank you.
It was a pleasure, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. And remember to celebrate. Have a great day.